They called it the Widowmaker, a car so violent, so unpredictable that it earned a nickname whispered with genuine fear in the world's finest driving schools. It could sit still for a heartbeat and then hurl itself sideways into a hedge before you even understood what was happening. And yet it became one of the most desired, most copied, and most legendary sports cars ever built. This is the story of the Porsche 911 Turbo, the car that turned a beloved family sports coupe into a snarling, tail-happy monster, and in doing so, created the template for the modern supercar. This is the story of the machine that taught the world to fear turbo lag and love it anyway. To understand the Turbo, you first have to understand the car it came from. By the early 1970s, the Porsche 911 was already a decade old, a rear-engined oddity that purists adored for its quick, chattering flat six and its knife-edge handling. But Porsche's engineers had a problem. Motorsport rules were changing, emissions regulations were tightening, and the company needed more power without simply making the engine bigger. The answer had been sitting in truck engines and aircraft for years, a device that used the car's own wasted exhaust gases to force more air into the engine. It was called a turbocharger, and almost no one had dared put one in a proper road car. Porsche decided to be first. The turbocharger promised something almost magical, enormous power from a small, light engine. Attach a turbine to the exhaust flow, spin it at unimaginable speed, and use it to cram extra air into the cylinders. In theory, you got the power of a much bigger engine for a fraction of the weight. In practice, the turbochargers of the 1970s had a brutal flaw. At low speed, there wasn't enough exhaust gas to spin the turbine, so the engine felt ordinary, even sluggish. Then, suddenly, the turbine would spin up, and a tidal wave of power would slam into the rear wheels with almost no warning. Engineers called this delay turbo lag. Drivers simply called it terrifying. Porsche's first taste of forced induction came not on the road, but on the racetrack. In the early 1970s, the company built the 917 for endurance racing, and later turbocharged versions of the 911 for the fearsome Can-Am series in North America. These cars produced power figures that seemed almost fictional for the era, overwhelming everything else on the grid. Drivers described the sensation as being fired out of a cannon, one moment nothing, the next moment violence. Porsche's engineers watched, learned, and began quietly asking a dangerous question. What if ordinary customers could buy this kind of power for the street? In 1975, Porsche unveiled its answer, a version of the 911 fitted with a single large turbocharger, flared wheel arches to cover wider tires, and a towering rear wing that quickly earned its own nickname, the Whale Tail. Internally, Porsche called it the 930. To the world, it simply became the 911 Turbo. It was, at the time, the fastest production car ever built in Germany, capable of a top speed that left contemporary supercars behind. But underneath the excitement lay the same old ghost. The engine's power lived entirely at high RPM, and that rear-mounted engine, sitting behind the rear axle, gave the car a terrifying tendency to swap ends when the power finally arrived. Journalists and racing drivers who tested the early 930 came back with the same warning, again and again. Lift off the throttle mid-corner, and the rear-engine weight distribution could snap the tail around with almost no notice. Then, once the driver corrected and reapplied power, the turbo would suddenly wake up, unleashing a flood of horsepower directly to the rear tires at the worst possible moment. Several inexperienced owners crashed spectacularly, some fatally, and the car earned its grim nickname across garages and racetracks worldwide. Porsche did not deny it. Instead, they leaned into the challenge, marketing the Turbo as a car that demanded respect, a car for serious drivers only. Rather than tame the beast, Porsche kept refining it, and in doing so built a legend. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, the 930 grew more powerful with each revision, its flat-six engine growing in size and boost pressure. The whale tail grew larger, the wheel arches wider, the sound more savage. It became the ultimate status symbol of the era. The car parked outside the biggest mansions and the flashiest nightclubs, a permanent fixture in the decade's culture of excess. Owning a 911 Turbo said something specific about you, that you had the money and supposedly the skill to handle real unfiltered danger. Then, in 1995, everything changed. Porsche introduced a new generation of turbo with a radical solution to the lag problem: twin smaller turbochargers instead of one large one. Two small turbines spooled up far quicker than one big one, delivering power in a smoother, more continuous wave instead of one terrifying punch. Even more revolutionary, Porsche added all-wheel drive, sending power to all four corners instead of just the rear. Almost overnight, the Widowmaker reputation began to fade. The new 911 Turbo was blisteringly fast, but shockingly, reassuringly composed. A car that a skilled amateur could drive to its limits without fear. This transformation had a startling side effect. Road testers discovered they could take the new twin-turbo 911 to a racetrack, drive it as hard as they possibly could, day after day, and it simply refused to misbehave. It became famous for a very different reason than its ancestor, not for how easily it could kill you, but for how completely it seemed to defy the laws of physics, gripping and launching out of corners with almost supernatural composure. It set blistering lap times that embarrassed cars costing 3 and 4 times as much. The Widowmaker had evolved into something almost impossibly friendly, without losing an ounce of its violence in a straight line. Over the following decades, the Turbo grew ever more sophisticated, and yet Porsche never fully tamed the drama, only refined it. Later generations pushed past 200 miles per hour, embraced electronic differentials, and started launching from a standstill with a force that could induce genuine nausea, all while remaining docile enough to drive comfortably to the shops. It became a strange paradox in the automotive world, a car that a novice could drive safely on a wet motorway, yet one that could still humiliate purpose-built race cars at a track day. Few other machines have managed to be both entirely usable and utterly savage at the same time. The influence of that original, terrifying 930 rippled across the entire car industry. Almost every major manufacturer eventually built their own turbocharged flagship, chasing the same intoxicating cocktail of a small engine and enormous power that Porsche had pioneered. Video games and movies immortalized the whale-tailed silhouette as a symbol of raw, dangerous speed. And despite the fear it once inspired, or perhaps because of it, the original air-cooled 930 Turbo has become one of the most collectible Porsches ever made, prices for pristine examples now reaching figures that would have stunned the engineers who built it. Today, the Porsche 911 Turbo stands as one of the greatest engineering redemption stories in automotive history. What began as a genuinely dangerous experiment, an unpredictable monster that killed careless drivers and terrified skilled ones, evolved through decades of relentless engineering into one of the most complete, capable, and beloved performance cars on Earth. It taught the world to fear turbo lag, and then taught the world how to conquer it. The Widowmaker never lost its bite. It simply learned exactly where to aim it. And that is why, nearly 50 years later, the whale tail still commands respect on every road it touches.